everybody. Welcome to Door to Door. I'm Lainey, and I'm here with my colleague Chris.
What's up,
And
everyone?
hey, and we are joined by Walter Thompson-Hernández. Hello.
Hey.
So good to have you. We got to see you at PLA not too long ago. Well, it seems not too long ago, but it also seems like a really long time ago.
Yeah, seems like forever.
And today we're going to talk about the Compton Cowboys, your new book. It just came out in April. And so a little bit about Walter first. Walter's a LA-based New York Times reporter and host. He's part of a multimedia Times reporting team called Surfacing, covers subcultures, marginalized, and offbeat communities around the world. And before working at the Times, he wrote for publications like NPR, Fusion, The Guardian, and many others. And he's reported from every continent and throughout the United States. And so this is the Compton Cowboys. Out now, everybody can go get it. And we have an adult version. We also have a YA version, a young readers, which I think makes it super special. It can be a kind of all-encompassing reading experience, both adults and kids. You can read it together. And this is the story of the Compton Cowboys, a group of African-American men and women who defy stereotypes and continue the proud centuries-old tradition of Black cowboys in the heart of one of America's most notorious cities. It's about trauma, transformation, race, identity, compassion, and Walter, it's one of my favorites that I've ever read. Best nonfiction. It's great narrative nonfiction because you really feel like you know them at the end, and I think it's also important that you tell this story because you have such a unique view of them. So, with that being said, I'm going to let you talk about the book a little. So, tell us about the Compton Cowboys.
Absolutely. So, the Compton Cowboys are a group of 10 friends, right, who were all born and raised in Compton. And they are sort of the second generation of Black riders in Compton. Nearly every one of their parents kind of like has rode horses or sort of brought these, practices from the South, right, from places like Oklahoma and Texas and Georgia. And so the Compton Cowboys, are a group of friends who are essentially really committed to, preserving this really rich and beautiful history of Black cowboys and cowgirls, like one that has been, entirely looked over by, our history books and by society. And they're also, riding horses as a way to both, I think, heal from a lot of the, really tough conditions that they grew up in, and also foster community. I think their horse ranch, which is like right in the heart of Compton, is more than a ranch. It's a place where they sort of like find like respite, and meaning, and where they, foster really beautiful relationships with other cowboys.
It's the official June pick for the LA Times Book Club, which you're also going to do an event tomorrow, so people can tune in 7:30 Pacific time. Los Angeles Times said, with the raw quality of a handheld documentary, the Compton Cowboys gallops into the origin story of its unique organization and its now fragile legacy. With the eye of a photographer, Thompson-Hernández captures the minute ways a community cedes power to another. Zooming in on granular detail, he fleshes out a neighborhood in all its colors, scents, conversational rhythms. This is a rare, unsensationalized portrait of a community fighting to reclaim its turf. Words and photographs, you reveal a three-dimensional people and place that can result only in time, trust, and compassion, which I think is amazing. And you also won the Whiting Award for this, and I've read that before because we did a podcast interview at PLA, and that was really fun to talk to you. But you've just, all of these quotes, people get it. They get this story is really important. So do you want to talk about what, like, the start of this group, this Compton Junior Posse, and how they've kind of transitioned into what they are now?
Absolutely. So the Compton Cowboy story like kind of begins in 1988, right? When Maisha Akbar, who is one of the Cowboys' aunts, two of the Cowboys' aunts actually, she moves to Compton, and she moves to the Richmond Farms, which is like where the Compton Cowboy Ranch is, right? And she, moves to Compton in the late 80s, which was a really sort of tumultuous time. There was a lot going on in Compton. There was like, the crack cocaine epidemic. There's a lot of violence going on. And so she essentially like buys these horses for her own children, and she buys these horses, and she realizes that, her own children sort of like really gravitate towards these animals, and their friends do as well. And so she starts to really sort of envision, like a life of horses, and sort of a program that's like both committed to teaching young people how to ride horses, and also keeping them off the streets, essentially. And so the Compton Junior Posse sort of forms in 1988, and is around for almost 30 years, and like does, is such a sort of powerful force in Compton. Is an organization that created so much change, and really impacted everyone. And so we like flash forward, the Compton Cowboys, today are essentially the children who she taught how to ride. And so they are these like young men and women who, all grew up in Compton, and sort of like when Maisha retires, right, in 2017, 2018, she sort of like hands the reins over to her nephew, Randy. And so Randy, has this idea of sort of like unifying his friends again, right? Because like some of them were still riding, some of them, had a lot of them had full-time jobs, had families, so they were kind of like, like parsed throughout the city. And so they kind of come back together in 2017, 2018 to ride horses, and to also ensure that, that they aren't Compton's last Black Cowboys. And so the book kind of picks up there, right? Like I begin the book, in 2018 or so, as they are sort of trying to figure it out, right? And I sort of start the book with this like really sort of like descriptive parade scene, right, where they're sort of like riding in this parade, the first one that they wrote in over 15 years in Compton. And that kind of like parade chapter, kind of, I think, both sets the stakes and also the tone for the book. Like it kind of shows that this is a story, that is rooted both in history and also what's happening today. It's a story about Black men and women, and the challenges that they face, and the really sort of creative ways that they have to, find to survive in Compton.
Right. And so, I mean, you say not to be the last Black Cowboys, but they're definitely not the first. This is like a really lot in history. And you talk about the people who are surprised maybe, but you were never surprised because you grew up seeing them. So what have been the reactions with people reading the book and not knowing about them?
Yeah, it's interesting because like I've been getting a lot more random emails from readers. Like every single day, I've been getting a few emails, and like, they're all great. Like most of them are positive. Like there's there's like a mixed bag, but people are genuinely astonished, right? And I think people are astonished often because, even thinking about like the words, right? Like Compton and Cowboys in a lot of people's sort of minds, like should not go together, right? Like I think like Compton is absolutely this like embattled city, right? That has this, is notoriously known for early 90s gangster rap, and violence and death and gangs. And I think, that is a part of the narrative, but it's not the entire narrative, right? So for a lot of people, like those words together kind of seem like oxymoronic. Compton and Cowboys shouldn't go. So I think, it looks jarring, to read, to see, sometimes to see Black men and women on horses, but it's like, people are overwhelmingly, enthralled and captivated by this story because, it's a story that we haven't heard in Los Angeles. I think, Black Cowboys have been around for a really long time, since like following the Civil War, like 1 in 4 of every Cowboys was in fact Black. So these aren't the first Cowboys at all.
Yeah. I love the story about how you first contacted them and their social media presence. I have their Instagram while you're talking also to everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm a pretty young like writer, like this was about like 2018, and I feel like if you're a millennial anything, like if you're a writer, a reporter, whatever it is, like we're going to use social media for what we do. I think it's like a tool that is made available to us. And I feel like older generations of maybe writers or reporters or journalists kind of like are weary of social media, like they think it's like not what you're supposed to do. Like you're supposed to pick up like a landline, and like call a source, right? Or a subject. But like I'm not really like that. I'm like I said, a millennial. So I found them on Instagram, and this is when they had about like 2,000 followers, like not 124,000 followers, right? So like I sent them a message on Instagram, and within like 10 minutes, I get a response. I'm like, hey, my name is Walter. I'm a New York Times writer. I live 10 minutes away from the ranch, literally. I'm back home for a few weeks. Like, I'm interested in writing a story about what you guys do, what you're about. And they responded immediately, and they were like, sure, come down to the ranch. And so I drive down to the ranch the very next day, and like I said, I think a lot of people sort of have this like perception of what a New York Times writer is supposed to look like. I think like people envision like some older white dude who lives in Connecticut, who like wears a fedora and like a long trench coat, and who like commutes to like the city every single day, and that's obviously not me on so many different levels. So I think like me showing up to the ranch in Compton was like such a funny moment, because like I'm essentially like one of their friends. Like, we all grew up in the same era, we're all the same age, and so I show up like blasting Kendrick Lamar's music like I normally do. Like, that wasn't even intentional. I kind of forgot, right? So I show up, and it's like a few of the Cowboys out there, but then they're also inside their house, and like, I get out of my car, and they're like very weary. They're like, who is this dude? Like he's wearing Nike Air Maxes. Like, like who is this guy? So I knock on the door, and I'm like, my name is Walter. I'm a New York Times reporter. And like, they were like, no way. And like, no way, like, this is not possible. Because the person who responded to me on their Instagram account like wasn't the same person who was there. Like, they were gonna get there later. So like, they were expecting like a New York Times like whatever type of person. And so like, but that sort of always happens. So what I have to do is like carry these like business cards with me, right? So I showed them a business card. I was like, look, like New York Times, and they're finally like, all right, okay, cool.
Glad to have the cred, although, fedora and trench coat, maybe one day. You never find it off.
I don't know. I don't know if that's me. Not my vibe.
So they were on social media trying to get their name out. And so once they came, they took over the ranch, it was really hard for them. And so what struggles did they go up against?
I think, there were a lot, but I think the biggest struggles were, of course, like, financially, right? Like, how do you, I mean, keeping any horse ranch alive is both like cumbersome, but it's also really expensive, in any part of the country. But I think in this horse ranch in Compton, like, they were sort of like, when the ranch was handed over to Randy Hook, they only sort of had like very little funds left over from what the board, had given them, and like these like donations were essentially running out, right? So I think financially, they've kind of always been in this like weird sort of like predicament where they're really living sort of like month to month, right? So I think that's one of the biggest challenges, and like trying to find new ways to really sort of generate revenue and money and resources. But also, I think like they are a group of 10 friends, and like any friends, right, like who are so interwoven and so tight knit and so close to each other, like they're gonna have problems and struggles. And so I think with them, like there was sort of like there's been a lot of moments when there's been like internal sort of like quarreling and fights, and I think they're all just trying to figure out like how to survive on a daily basis. A lot of them have children and families, and it gets complicated when like people have different ideas about the ranch and different ideas about what it means to be a cowboy. And Randy's like this person who is trying to manage all these personalities, and sometimes he succeeds and sometimes he fails. So I think it's like both the finances, but also just like what any close group of friends experiences, and that's tension and conflict.
Yeah. You talked about, speaking of appearances and maybe not looking like people would think, what are people's reactions when they see someone riding down the street, and you talk a lot about it being a protection for them in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like these cowboys don't just ride because they love horses, right? Like they also ride as a form of protection against, local police and also rival gangs. And I think it's like, it's both beautiful that these horses can act as armor essentially, or as a shield, but it's also tragic, right? That like that these really incredible animals like have to protect these Black men and women from, police harassment and from also gangs. But I think, people respond to the Cowboys differently. I think most people know about the Cowboys in Compton, but there are a lot of people who don't. And so, like in writing this story, I had to spend a year and a half with the Cowboys, right? And that meant me chasing them around Compton on foot, and like the reactions are so beautiful, right? Like most children, like run up to the horses and stop them, take photos with them, and like people honk at them on the street, but like in like really positive way. They're like, "Hey, Cowboys," So it's like they're almost like these like neighborhood superheroes essentially, It's like every young child wants to pet a horse, and they understand that, and they're also really open to that.
And Walter, you mentioned spending a year and a half with these men and women. And I think a lot of people, when they think about reporter, aside from the fedora, is kind of cold and separated from the subject. And you're
Right.
spending a lot of time with them. Could you talk about kind of how you walk that line of being a reporter, but also being part of the story?
Yeah. It's I think something that that journalism school doesn't teach you, right? And I say this as someone who has actually never been to journalism school, right? But like what I've heard from like friends and colleagues, right, is that that sort of line between like subject, which like I don't even use the word subject. Like the word subject to me is so like dehumanizing and so like removed from humanity, I think. But I think the line between like documentarian or writer or journalist and person and human, like a lot of folks are really trained to have a sort of like barrier, right? This like objective lens on the story. And I think for me, as someone who identifies with the Cowboys racially, but also geographically, right? Like we're from the same area, we're all men and women of color. It was really hard for me to sort of often remove myself from the story. I think I was both a participant and an observer, and someone who, like, I was really committed to writing the most honest story. And what helped me was understanding like all the nuance and context, right, of their lives. Sometimes I could sort of think about my own life and how it related to them. And I think that's different, right? I think a lot of folks, especially historically, right, have sort of parachuted into communities, and sort of like, gone to a community, especially a community of color, and extracted information and knowledge, and you never hear from them again. And I think like that's not my approach in any way. And it's a double-edged sword, right? Because like on one hand, I think like it's really important for me to establish real connections with like the people who I interview and spend time with, and to acknowledge their humanity. But it's also tough to leave that situation. I think for me the hardest part is like saying goodbye, right? These are people who I consider friends now, and maybe like a part of my family, right? So I think it was a learning process, and I think I learned a whole bunch. I learned that at the end of the day, they respect the honesty, and I think this book is a work of nonfiction. And that a lot of the Cowboys, obviously, in reading the book, they were forced to confront a lot of things that they have really sort of put out into the world, and traumas and death and violence. And so I'm really grateful that they trusted me.
Yeah, they have the saying, "The streets raised us, the horses saved us." So what do these horses mean to them? Not just on social media they put all these pictures and they ride them, obviously, but what do they also bring emotionally for that trauma?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like there are countless studies, right, that sort of highlight the effects of equine therapy. I think historically it's been a really a helpful tool to really help with PTSD like conditions, trauma, autism, anxiety, stress. Like there's something so healing about being around horses, right? Like they are such beautiful and compassionate animals. And I think more than anything, like to me, the ranch is so much more than a ranch. It's almost like a healing center, right? Like a sort of like indirect sort of healing center, and direct, of course, right? But I think it's just so powerful to see like how these horses, like the power they have to diffuse situations, and if anyone knows about horses, like when you approach a horse, like your energy has to be calm, and horses are really smart animals, and they're really perceptive. And I think, they teach us to be calmer, and like horses teach us to communicate in ways that are respectful and calm. And like the Cowboys have done is taken those lessons and really extended them, towards their family and community. So it's an incredible resource, I think, that they have.
So take us to the ranch. What are we're driving up to the ranch. What do we see? What does it look like?
Yeah. So if we're driving to the ranch, it's on a street called Caldwell, and Byron, who is Randy and Carlton's uncle, is probably on the porch smoking a cigarette. He's probably wearing a black faded t-shirt or blue, and he has these baggy jeans, and he's just smoking a cigarette. Like, this is what he does all day long. And the first, outside of Byron, we probably see a couple trucks, and we're immediately introduced to Red Dog, which is the ranch dog. He's this like Australian cattle breed, I think, like some breed of horses that of dogs that's really good with like cattle and horses. And so Red Dog is like a central figure in the ranch. Like, he's everywhere, And so after we meet Red Dog, like, we walk to the driveway, and it's so interesting, right? Because like, I think, when you get to this house, it's like a 3-house property. You can't see the ranch from the street. Like, you kind of have to go back there, and it becomes like this other world. Like, it's sometimes loud on the street. There's like music and cars and people, but like, once you enter the ranch, it's a whole nother world. And there's like, the sound of horses and the sound of birds, and there's this like really beautiful riding arena, and there's like 15 stables, and there's like 2 llamas, there's a cow now, just like really like Dr. Dolittle energy. It's like all types of animals. No, really, like the ranch has so many types of animals, and it's really cool. It's a really special place.
I have some photos if you want to talk about them for a
Sure.
minute.
This is a photo of Anthony. Anthony is the oldest member of the Cowboys, and what he usually does every Friday is he rides his horse Coda from the ranch to his granddaughter's school in Watts. And this Friday that I took this photo, I was lucky enough to have been there with him, and lucky enough to have been able to capture this moment. Like, these kids are going crazy. And, I wish we had sound and video, because these kids were out of control, and it's funny because like the school principal, like, is really cool with Anthony, and, like, it's a really positive thing to have his horse. The kids go crazy. But I think on this day, he kind of had to leave early because the kids were just out of control. Like, they all wanted to ride the horse. They were like fighting each other to ride the horse. So like, after this photo, I think the person actually on the left over here, like in the back, I think that was the school principal, and like that they're actually coming towards us, telling us that like, hey Anthony, man, you gotta go. This is a photo of Keenan, who is also one of the Cowboys, and Keenan is a full Cowboy, and he had just gotten a haircut earlier that day, so he was really feeling good. Like, he was really like, in the mirror, he was like, looking at himself. I think this was taken at like 8:30 in the morning, and a friend of his had just cut his hair, and he was getting ready for the day, and like that cowboy hat was in the bathroom, and he just decided to put it on, and was just like getting ready for the day. This is a photo of the Louisiana restaurant that's like right by the ranch. And this is what they do, a few times a week. Like, they will hop on the horses bareback, and they will ride to buy food. And I actually, this was one of the chapters in the book. I actually write about this, about how Keenan's horse sort of like escapes and gets spooked. And this is like such a funny scene because as the book shows, the restaurant's manager, comes out because, these horses, they leave a trail, right? Like these horses are kind of messy sometimes and like they leave like, horse poop. So they were doing that all over the restaurant outside. So Keenan had to pick it up with his hands. And I'll never forget this moment. And it was like this like hilarious exchange between the manager and Keenan. And, Keenan looking around to like, find something to pick it up with. He couldn't find anything, so he had to use his hands. But like, this is, I think, a photo that was really sort of emblematic of their experience. Like I didn't set this photo up. They were just sort of like waiting for their food. And it was a really special moment.
So did they always ride with no saddle? Like that's always what they do?
Yeah. So they ride with no saddle. It's like how they look at it, it in their eyes, they sort of are creating like more sort of like, powerful, intimate connections with the horses. I think that there's something to say about learning how to ride this way. Riding with a saddle after learning that way is really easy, but I think they also form like stronger connections with the horses. I took this photo the morning of the Compton Christmas parade, and it was a really powerful moment because this was the first time that they had all sort of like rode together in 15 years. And Louis, who is the older gentleman here, who's wearing a white T-shirt, he's Randy and Carlton's father. And like about a minute after I took this photo, Louis took a photo with his own phone, and he just started bawling up. He just started crying and sort of like, I was standing right next to him, and he sort of said something like, I didn't think I'd ever see them ride again. So it was a really incredible morning, and they look really great and cool.
Those are amazing photos.
Thank you.
Picture right there. Yeah, Chris is into photography himself, so I'm sure.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I haven't had any photos that good though. Those are like really special moments. So yeah, thank you for sharing them, Walter.
Thank you.
And I'm curious because I know you said that they're known within the Compton community and maybe LA at large. Within the community though, are people, the kids obviously are thrilled. Is there like, how does the community feel about them? Or is it just kind of are they part of the landscape? It's not.
Yeah. I think it's both, I think like, that there are people in Compton who fully understand that, cowboys and horses have been a part of the Compton experience for a long time. And I think there's also folks in Compton, because, Compton's a pretty big neighborhood, there's like folks in Compton who, also don't know much about the Cowboys. And I think there's another segment of the community that, is really sort of like interested in creating more opportunities for horses and for horse riders. I think, they're at a point now where they have a lot of visibility, and I think they are using that in a really positive way. And they're trying to sort of like, create like more after school horse programs throughout the city. And that's what they're trying to do right now.
Great. And I see, so you have your latest New York Times article behind you.
Oh yeah.
Do you want to talk about that a little? Because I think this book is, of course, really timely, but now especially with George Floyd and the protests. Do you want to talk about that a little, like what they're doing now?
Sure. Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think it's like a really sort of like bittersweet moment, right? Because I think on one hand, about when 2.5 weeks ago now, when this African American woman decided to ride her horse in Oakland, California, at one of the demonstrations, like following the murder of George Floyd. I think that was nationally like the first time that someone had rode a horse at a demonstration. And I think a few days after that, this group of Black riders in Houston, where George Floyd is from, also decided to ride at a demonstration. And social media kind of blew up after that. And a day after that, there was a Black rider who rode at a demonstration in Chicago. And so that week was like kind of like the week for Black cowboys and cowgirls, like at demonstrations. And so the Compton Cowboys organized a peace ride that same Sunday, paired with Compton's mayor, and it was a really beautiful ride. You know, and I wrote a story about it, and I framed it behind me, right? And you know, it's interesting because like I've never, like, I have a lot of stories that I have in print, you know, but I've never framed a story before. Like, this is the first time I ever framed a story, and I think for me, I was like, man, like, this is a really special moment, you know, like something about this story, you know, like the beautiful spread to me was just so timely, and I was like, I have to frame this, you know, and so I framed it, and it's behind me. But I think, you know, it was a really powerful story, right? Because I think historically, you know, mounted police at demonstrations and protests, you know, sort of like become this like oppositional figure that represent power and authority and control. But when you have sort of like Black men and women on horses on the other side of that, like, there's something so powerful and so inspiring about that for fellow demonstrators, right? And so the story was kind of about that, about like what it meant for Black men and women to ride in these demonstrations at a time like now.
Yeah, I saw them on the news the other day, and I was like, oh, I know them.
Yeah.
It's great to see them. And somebody actually just mentioned, speaking of being on TV, the CBS This Morning. That was a really great clip, and someone in the chat was just like, don't forget to mention that. It was really great.
Yeah, it was really cool. That was a really cool feature and special. It was really great.
Yeah. Let's see. A lot of people are excited, saying ordering the book. Some people are saying, I loved it so much. Great reading experience.
Order it twice.
Yeah, order. We have the one reader's edition too.
Yeah, exactly.
Someone says, how does one get to be a cowboy? Which I think you talked a little bit about with the junior posse. But do those kids throughout the years, do they keep in touch with them, or is it kind of a seasonal thing?
Yeah, so it's sort of like a seasonal thing. The youth riding club kind of closes during the winter, but opens up in the spring and summer and fall. And you know, like I said earlier, like, it's a really tight knit community. Like, it's like seeing how sort of intergenerational it is really inspiring and beautiful. You know, there are riders who are 4 years old and riders who are in their like 70s. You know, and it's really sort of like the gamut of people. But it fosters a really beautiful community.
Someone said they want to see this as a graphic novel. I don't know if you can pull some strings, Walter. You know, some great artists, but
yeah, no, it's like, yeah, it's such a beautiful story. You know, like I was so excited that it was also like a YA book. You know, I think for me, like, selfishly, I was like, man, like, if I was like 8, 9, 10, 13, 14, like, I would have loved to read this book, you know? But I'm also thinking about like the younger generation. Like, this is also a great children's book, like, you know, an illustrated book. Like, I think that'd be like an amazing opportunity too. Like, just like, you know, get all the generations, you know, like, this is, I mean, but it's kind of cool, right? I think now that it's an adult and YA book, like, this is a book that an entire family can potentially read together. And I feel like that's so rare, and it's so cool, and it's so timely, right? Because like, this isn't just a book about cowboys. It's also a book about race and about identity and about like learning about like racial injustice and how it impacts folks. So I think it's, I hope people, you know, see that, right? That it's not just about horses and cowboys. It's actually about something way deeper.
Yeah, like you and I spoke about this at PLA, but I was saying that when people were walking by, they were seeing the cover and it would just automatically stop them, because they would have two reactions. It was either, oh, I know about them, or I didn't know that was a thing. But also just like even high school teachers looking for something to give to their students, and they were saying how hungry they are for good nonfiction, but also that represents different people that you would learn about. And so I think the YA version is perfect for that.
Absolutely. No, I agree with that 100%.
Yeah. And really, the history of Black cowboys in general, I mean, I'm just thinking about whether it's Juneteenth or the Tulsa race riots, and just these histories and who gets to tell them and what we don't know. And I think there's just so much that I didn't learn in school that so many don't. And it's these kind of opportunities and these kind of stories that you're bringing to people that really are eye-opening and valuable. So, so thank you again for writing it.
No, I definitely agree with you. Thank you.
Well, I wanted to just do a quick reminder that we did the podcast episode. So we talk, in detail about a lot of things. So everybody can go listen to that on our SoundCloud page, Library Love Fest
I'll post
podcast.
a link. Yeah.
Yeah.
Link will be in the comments, y'all.
Went somewhere else. So yeah, that was really fun. And you also spoke at the lunch at PLA, and I think that was important. I think I got the most out of just talking about the relationship with these men and their horses, but also what you were saying. It's not just, about the Cowboys. It's about a grander picture. And so everybody should go listen to that and pick up their copy.
All right.
Oh, and one more thing. Tomorrow, you're taking over our Instagram page.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
We're really excited to have you. And you have, look at those photos. You have great pictures on Instagram. So we can't wait to have you have your e-card, which we'll post later. But see pictures from you about the book and maybe, where your writing space is. You're really unique because you write a lot of places, all continents. So we can't wait to see some photos from you.
It's going to be great.
Yeah. So everybody go Harper Library on Instagram. It's all day tomorrow.
Cool. Well, I think that kind of covers it for us today, Walter. Again, we could go on. I think the podcast interview you did was fantastic with Lainey, so I highly recommend viewers check that out. Check out the Instagram takeover tomorrow. Anything else you want people to know about? You're a busy man, so if there's anything you want.
I kind of want to know where that background is. That's such a cool looking beach, man. I wish we were all there and hanging out. I want to know, to be honest. I
someday, Walter.
Yeah,
someday. This is Indiana, but yeah, this is
some beach in Indiana for sure.
Yeah, some beach in Indiana, obviously.
No,
yeah,
but I have a podcast show coming out with the LA NPR station. It's called California Love, and it's really cool because it's my first time working in sound and audio, and it's also a beautiful medium. There's a lot of writing involved. The whole show is about kind of a first person audio memoir about me coming back to LA and grappling with the idea of home and stories and memories that I have in LA and how some of those are still apparent, but some of those are gone. And so it's a really beautiful show. It comes out July 9th and it's available on Spotify, Apple, wherever, everywhere. And I'm really excited about that.
Very cool.
Excited too for that one.
Yeah, 2020, 2021. It's a Walter takeover in general. So just everyone watching, you'll see plenty more of him. And again, Compton Cowboys is on sale now, as is the Young Readers edition. So like Walter said, grab 2 copies at least. And
also go follow the Compton Cowboys on social media.
Yeah.
I love seeing their live videos. It makes me smile. So
it's really cool. Yeah. They're really cool.
All right, well, Walter, thanks a ton for joining us today. Well, anyone, if you have questions, shoot them to us. We'll get them over to Walter. But I think that's it. Lainey, anything else we need to cover before we go?
It's been great.
No? Awesome. Well, again, Walter, thanks for joining us. Everyone, thanks for watching. We'll be back on Thursday with authors Janie Chong and S.A. Chakraborty. So tune in for that. And of course, check out our Instagram tomorrow so you can get more Walter. We'll be doing our Instagram takeover, and see you all next time. Thanks a ton. Bye, everyone.